Alright, so here we're going to talk about how to understand the information that a VOR instrument is giving to us, and specifically what the VOR is telling us in the context of an HSI instrument. So when you're looking at VORs on the HSI, there's basically three pieces of information that it can tell you. So you have an OBS sitting right here, which is basically the configuration of where do you want to fly, either inbound or outbound, but where do you want to fly towards or away from the station. And we're talking like directly towards or directly away from the station, generally speaking. And then you have this little flag here, this tiny little arrow, and it'll flip between over here, and then sometimes it goes down there, and that's your flag, as we call it. So you have a to flag or a from flag. If it's pointing up towards the top arrow, then it's showing a to flag, or it assumes that you're going to be going towards the station. And if you have a from flag, then it would point at the bottom, and then it assumes that you're going away from the station. The last piece of information it gives us is the CDI, which is right in the middle here. And that's going to tell you where you are in relation to where you actually want to be. And where you want to be, that's basically set by your OBS setting right here. So what I have here is I've tuned it into the Springbank VOR. And the Springbank VOR is basically right at the airfield center, but we can use it in the context of, let's say, approaching a runway center line or something along those lines. So right now I've set it up with the runway heading for runway 35. So you got runway 35 is a heading of 350. I've set it up so that it has a to flag and it's showing 350 because I want to fly inbound on, let's say, a straight in final for runway 35 on a heading of 350. So I want to track towards the station on an inbound track of 350. Now I could set this to any runway I wanted. Let's just talk about inbounds for now. So if I want to track 270, I would just move that little course knob over until it got to something along the lines of like 270, and then it would show me the parameters if I wanted to approach runway 26, and I could set it for basically any runway that I wanted to. So let's just work it for 35 right now. So the assumptions here are that it assumes that we're going to try to track inbound direct to the station on a heading of 350. We may or may not be on that inbound track, but it's going to run the assumption that that's what we would like to do initially. And based on that assumption, you can see we're basically on file for runway 35, more or less. It's not going to be the most accurate because the VOR is right in the middle of the airport, but it'll be close enough. So if I were to set it up, assume I want to go inbound to the station, direct 350, we have a to flag, which is good because we want to go towards the station, and it's CDI centered. So we're basically on the center line in theory. Now, if I were to go and move us to the left of center line all the way over there, you can see that our desired track on the CDI moves to the right. Just think of the CDI as this is where your track actually is. And in our case, it's somewhat to the right. But one trick with VORs is that if you always just assume it's to your right, especially with a classical VOR instrument, you're going to get very, very confused very quickly, because unless you're flying the heading of 350, or you're flying the head of the needle on the HSI, it isn't necessarily to your right. It might actually be to your left if I went and did a 180-degree turn, let's say. But what is true in all these cases is that it is to your east, right? So it's going to be to the right of 350. And that's a better way to think about it. So because it's to the right of 350, it's relatively to the east. And does that make sense? Yeah, absolutely. If we went eastbound like we did over there, we would eventually get to the runway center line, and then the CDI would center as you do that. And then you could go all the way too far past east like such, and then you'd be like, hey, well, the CDI is now actually to your west now. Okay, so we have to go somewhat westbound. So we start to go westbound like such, and then eventually the CDI comes back in, and then it shows us that we're centered, more or less on the center line for runway 35. So that's basically how the CDI works. And the thing with the CDI doesn't matter on your heading. So I could go, let's say I could be right on the center line. So put us basically right centered, and I could change my heading, and I could totally, point myself eastbound, whatever. But the CDI is not actually going to change at all. I could do a full 180, and then now I'm pointing basically outbound, so I'm flying like the wrong direction on final right now, and the CDI is still showing center. Now the fun thing with the HSI is it's still going to show you, even though you're pointing backwards, where you should go. So if I went to the west more, it's saying, hey, center line's still you know, according to the HSI, to your east, not to your left, but to your east per se. Because we've configured it on an HSI, it is honestly actually to our left, but a classic VOR won't necessarily give you that indication, so it's much better to just look at it and be like, oh, I have to fly eastbound to get to that center line. So you go, and then maybe you go turn the plane eastbound like such. So there we go, now we're roughly eastbound, so now we're kind of gonna intercept it because the runway is just off of our left there. So we go, and then we start moving in until we've basically intercepted that center line, and then we turn onto the runway center line, and then there you go. Now we're basically on the runway center line. So what about the two from flags? Those indicate that assuming that you are going to be flying the heading that you have on the OBS, so in our case 350, assuming you fly 350 and let's say the CDI is centered, you are going to be flying towards the station if you have a 2 flag. Now, if we go all the way past the station, right, you're still flying a heading of 350 all the way around. And then, of course, right as we approach the station, as we go past here, the CDI, because it's an infinite beam, goes to one side or the other, hit a zone of ambiguity, and then the flag flips, and now we're still flying 350, right? But we're going to go more to, like, away from the station, because we're already past the center line. Now it's like we're departing runway 35, and we want to track that center line outbound. So in that case, if we wanted to track the center line outbound on a departure for runway 35, well, the runway tracks a little bit to my right, so I'm going to move a little bit to my right like such. And then now it's centered, and then I can kind of keep following that track outbound. Now, let's say I wanted to come back around and land runway 17 instead. I could keep it set up like it is right now, and I could honestly just, you know, turn the airplane around like such, so it's pointed right at the airport. And I could still use it backwards, so, you know, center line's going to be to my left on the HSR, to my east relatively. And then I could track that inbound. But the problem is it's kind of set up backwards, because it's basically saying, well, it wants you to track outbound, so it's got the from flag, but because we've put it on an HSI and the actual VOR is flipped 180 degrees, like you can still track it, but it's not as efficient because it doesn't really make sense. It's basically saying, like, you're tracking something inbound and you have a from flag, so you're not really tracking something inbound if you have a from flag. You can do it, but it's just not the best way to do it. You'd be much better off going and flipping this HSI to the actual inbound track for runway 17, let's say, and we could put, you know, say runway 17 was straight south on the final heading that we want. Okay, well, that center line is going to be a little to my left, so I go a little bit to my left, and then now I'm right there, and then I track inbound to the airport, and now we would be inbound to land, let's say, runway 17. And that would be a much more efficient way to set that instrument up. So basically, in summary, whatever you set on the top here is going to be the heading that you fly once you have intercepted that track, whether it be inbound, outbound, does not matter. If you're flying outbound, the heading's 360, then you put 360 right on your OBS setting. If you're flying inbound and it's a heading of 180 that you're flying once you're actually intercepted inbound, then you put 180 on the top. Now, where students often get confused with the OBS settings is, especially in the context of a VOR, we have this terminology called radials. And radials can only ever go outbound. So you have to understand, when ATC gives you a radial, they are doing it from their perspective. So they can see where you are in relation to the station using their instruments. And so they're going to be like, I want you to intercept the 180 radial outbound, let's say. And that quite literally means, in relation to the station, pick up a heading of 180 outbound. And that makes sense, because radios go outbound. They're like spokes on a wheel. They just go from the station towards, well, outbound to infinity on whatever heading. So that'd be the radial terminology. Now, where it gets really weird is when you have the 180 radial, but you're tracking it inbound. Because if you're tracking a radial inbound, right, remember radials in this context are always going to be outbound. So if you're tracking something inbound, you have to flip whatever the radial was in order to actually properly track it. Again, you could set it up backwards and it would look weird and you'd probably still be okay, but you'll be really confused. So you're much better off saying, if you're tracking the 180 radial inbound, you're going to have to set up the HSI or the OBS setting to 360. It's just whatever it is minus or plus 180 degrees, whichever one gets you to your desired reciprocal heading. And then from there, we would intercept the station, and then as soon as we hit that radial, we would track that inbound. So my advice would be, when you get a clearance with a radial, if it's a radial, say 180 inbound, just flip whatever number they gave you, and then just track that inbound, set that as the OBS, and track it the same way you normally would. If they give you the 180 radial outbound, then you're also going to be flying the 180 track outbound. It's just a weird reference to terminology, because radials are always from reference to the station, as opposed to inbound, outbound tracks are in relation to you or the aircraft. So because you're the one flying the aircraft, if they give you a reference that's in relation to the station, you have to make sure that you flip it so that it makes sense in reference to your aircraft. And then just a final check, once you've set it up, it should all show up the way that you would expect it to. So if you wanted to track whatever radial towards the station, or an inbound track, then you should see a 2 flag. If you don't see a 2 flag, you're either on the wrong side of the station or you've set it up wrong. And generally the latter is true. You've probably set it up wrong, because ATC wouldn't really give you a clearance that's on the wrong side. But if you've confirmed you've definitely set it up right, then maybe give them a call. And same deal if you want to track the 180 radial outbound or an outbound track of 180, they're the same thing, just different terminology. Then you should see a from flag once you've set it up. And then once you've set it up, you got the correct flag, it matches what you actually want to do. Okay, you've set it up correctly. Now you just have to turn from the head of the needle towards whatever the direction the CDI is. So in our case, if we want to track this 180 inbound, because we have a 2 indication, we would turn somewhere between south and east. And how much we turn just depends on what your intercept angle is. Do you want to intercept at 90 degrees? Well, turn eastbound. Do you want to intercept at 10? Turn 10 degrees left of south, and so on.